Excellent. Well, this is Adoption Promises Broken. I am Dawn J. Post. I'm an attorney and I'm the founder of a nonprofit law firm, Themis Youth Law and Advocacy. And just to begin, I would like to have some idea of who the audience is. So if we could do virtual show of hands in terms of the little icon, how many are adoptees? Just get a general sense. Okay, I'm seeing like 4 or 5, 5 persist. Oh, that tells me 5 raise their hand. Excellent. And how many are, and if you can take that down, how many are adoptive parents? 5. Excellent. And how many are in the, would be considered adoption professional? Whether that's therapist, caseworker, otherwise in the field? 3. All right, excellent. Well, this is an excellent mix. And I really appreciate you taking the time to attend this session, which I believe is incredibly important. And to give you a little bit of background about myself, I believe the reason that many of you might be here today is the same reason why I became a lawyer, and that's to make a difference. I decided when I was 10, I was going to be a lawyer for children. And that was following the high-profile death of a girl in the state of Maine where I grew up. And in my mind, had she had an attorney, I thought there could have been a difference. And so I actually dropped out of high school when I was 16 and convinced the local college to accept me without a diploma to speed up my path to become a lawyer because I wanted to be an attorney for children. And I actually began working for legal services by 18. And so I have had a long career now, which I can't believe I'm saying, in child welfare. And my background really is in foster care and child welfare primarily. However, in the last year particularly, it has expanded. And so after I became an attorney for children, I was based in New York City and initially was an attorney for children at Legal Aid Society Juvenile Rights Practice, where I became a director, and then subsequently went to the Children's Law Center, where I was also a co-director. In New York City, unlike other states, where I think 26 other states don't have attorneys for children, every child in foster care, 0 to 21, has an attorney. And so that is very rare in some states, and some states don't have that role at all. Sometimes you might hear people referred to as a guardian ad litem, which can be a very different looking role. It might be a lawyer, but it might not be a lawyer, depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in. And also CASA, you might have heard, it might be advocating for the child. But there are a lot of different roles, and the attorney for the child in New York is very much directed towards youth voice. That because children as young as 7 are charged with delinquency, or at the time as young as 7 were charged with delinquencies, if they are directing their litigation in a delinquency case, then why wouldn't they also be directing and making their position known in child welfare and foster care cases? That age has since been raised, but the thinking is still the same, is that children know them, have opinions and thoughts that really should be respected and shared. And so we do very much a direct advocacy model. So I am a huge proponent of youth voice and empowering youth voice. At the Children's Law Center, when I became a director there, I did more high conflict custody and visitation work, and in addition to doing child welfare and foster care. But as a director, I often sat in on meetings with other directors in the city with child welfare and judges. And at the time, everyone was talking about, how do we get adoptions done faster? And that's because of the law Adoption and Safe Families Act, ASFA, which places tight time frames on adoption. And in order to get really reimbursed by the federal government, you have to comply with those timeframes. And so it was, people were talking about, let's put little booties on the kids that need to get adopted fast onto the court files, and that will remind the judge, and things like that. It was a little silly, but that was one of the things I remember. And this was back in 2010. And I was talking about, what about making them better? We know in family court that kids are coming back in a variety of ways, and that just because kids are adopted doesn't mean that's the end of the story. And people really didn't want to talk about that because obviously the priorities look very, very different when we're talking about the government and what the courts needed to do and what the children's services needed to do. But I felt it was really critical to focus on the fact that we had to acknowledge that we were seeing youth returning and no longer living with their adoptive families, and to understand why that was happening in order to make adoptions better. And so some people might think that I'm anti-adoption because of the advocacy that I do, and that's not necessarily true. What I've always been about is very much, how can we use the information, particularly because I work with so many clients who don't have relationships with their adoptive parents, to be able to inform our systems and our people who work in these systems to make them better. And so that's what I've been doing for since 2011, where I wrote my first law review article addressing this. And so I wanted to get a sense of whether it was just professionals in the room or the population, and acknowledge that there's very different perspectives on this. And so, and it's really important to understand the competing interests in all of this, to be able to understand the issues of why I see in particular adoptions fail. And so what we're going to be talking about today is about how adoption is marketed as forever. And that's not just in the private domestic arena or intercountry arena. This is in foster care. You know, I myself was guilty as a young baby lawyer of saying to a pre-adoptive parent, just hang in there, as if, the adoption is going to make everything better. When they were struggling and saying, I'm not sure if this is the right, thing to do. And you're, because the focus was so much on just getting the adoptions finalized. And so the pressures are different. And so there's very much this idea, and particularly in the media and general media, of that white picket fence, beautiful families, and how children, do better in adoptive homes versus in the birth homes that they may have been removed from, which isn't necessarily true. And obviously, there's always an evolution in how we think about these issues. But adoption marketed as forever is something that is still very much at the forefront of what people think adoption is. And what I'm here to talk about is that when placements fail, that children lose protection. They no longer have the protection of the families. They no longer have the protection of the systems that they were in. And these failures are really hidden, and that they're untracked. And that makes it difficult to advocate for, because if you talk to a legislature or if you're talking to a court, they always want to know, but how many are we talking about? Because if it's not a significant number, then it's not worth their time in their mind, right? And so that makes it really complicated, because when you're talking about somewhat of an invisible population of youth, it's hard to advocate for them with the people that are involved without getting them visible. And sometimes that happens through media attention and other ways. And so I have actually used in New York City the media since 2011 to be able to highlight these issues and to collaborate with other institutional stakeholders to be able to understand why that's happening. So I ask.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is terrible. And it's really important what you're talking about. And I'm so glad I hear. So I hate to be disruptive, but for some reason, I'm really getting triggered here um, that you didn't ask how many birth mothers are actually in this group. And I'm just worried about the way you're heading off that. And it is really important. Again, I do not want you to think I'm not trying to derail you or disrupt, but I'm hoping at some point you'll also, especially with placement failures,
Yeah.
that birth mothers will be acknowledged. Anyway, I got it off. The trigger's gone, so thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Actually, that's an excellent point, and my apologies for not even thinking of that and failing to ask. But one of the things that I will talk about is the initial study that we ran at the Children's Law Center, which was around where children were going, was often times back to birth families. And to birth mothers. And in fact, the whole reason that I started a study around this issue was because of a case that I observed where a birth mother was ready, willing, and able to step up and take the adopted child who'd been abandoned, and the court wouldn't allow that to happen. And so that definitely is a part of this dynamic, and my apologies for not asking that. But when I ask, and also understand that this is an overview. There's only so much we can cover in 90 minutes. And I also want to acknowledge that someone emailed me prior to this, but I've been having email issues this week and my domain was down and asking if I would cover a particular issue. And so I will follow up with email on particular questions and direct to resources. But there things like this I have addressed, particularly in my early work in a law review article and talking about the restoration of parental rights, and also how important it is for birth families to be involved with adoptive families and having more openness around this. But to get to my next point, which is the right title, when I initially put forward this presentation to be considered, I was more in an adversarial frame of mind, frankly. And so when I went back and as I was preparing for this and looked at it, I realized how adversarial that actually looked. And also, really, because we're all here wanting the same thing to do the best and make a difference, understanding this isn't just about legal and policy. This is about just people and social work and the work that we're doing every day and filling in some of those gaps. So the objectives in terms of what I'd like to see do today is to identify the movement of children post-adoption, where they're actually going, where they're ending up, sometimes back in birth families and birth mothers, and post-adoption failure points in terms of understanding what made the adoption break and understanding the issue from all sides, and also exploring strategies for reform. So the myth of permanency, as I previously talked about, is about the myth, we all think finalization means you're safe. Everything's done, no worries, right? And the success of adoption is only measured at the time that the adoption is finalized. And that's the way that the federal government counts it, and that's the way that the courts count it. And what I'm suggesting here is we have to keep involved and remain involved well past to ensure that there is success past adoption. And we have to actually speak to the people who are involved and not assume that just because a young person has been adopted that that's the end of the story. Now, I placed a photograph of, obviously a child with a trash bag, and that's because I actually had a client who at 10 years old was sent back to her birth mother with a trash bag behind her on the subway, but told by her adoptive parent, no longer want you. And that was the fourth child to return to the birth parent, not all from the same adoptive home, and dragging their belongings with them. And a part of that dynamic as well is that the adoption subsidy continues to get paid to the adoptive family, even if the child no longer lives with them. So I'd like to share with you one of my early clients' stories, Jaquan. who I remain very close to this day with him and his children. But this is his story from the early days of my advocacy.
My name is Jaquan. I have been in more than 15 homes. I feel like I live in a world where my voice was never heard. In the beginning of my time in foster care, just your basic home to home throughout all 5 boroughs, as far as placement went. It is part of the reason I know as many languages as I do, because half of the houses I went to didn't speak English. I learned Spanish, Creole, and even Patois. I'm a very forgiving person, but there are those I can't forgive. In some homes, I suffered mental and physical abuse. Later on, I got adopted by the most abusive foster parent of them all. I got kicked out of a home, and at the age of 17, I was renting a room in Baltimore. I had to start working at McDonald's, going to school, and trying to pay rent. It wasn't easy, so I went down to welfare, and the guy told me, "Oh, you're disapproved because you're receiving some sort of income." Turns out my adopted mother kept getting paid for me for years, even after she kicked me out. It is sad that I suffer with trust and not knowing how to love, all because it was never given to me. It truly brings tears to my eyes when I think about how much pain I have endured, never to have even gotten a taste of what it means to truly be loved. Can you imagine growing up in a house where you're constantly reminded you don't belong and you are no kin to them? I feel love has a limit. If you never got it young, you will be confused when you get older. You'll be questioning everyone's motives and feel they want to bring you nothing but pain. But I simply refuse to have a negative outcome. I have managed to stay on the right side of the law. I was never given the proper ground to stand on, but I will make my own way, and I will be a better father to my beautiful baby girls.
So I want to use his story to highlight how we see children move after adoption. And so, what I had originally talked about in New York City when I was having these conversations in these citywide meetings is at that time, because I was solely in family court, was how were we seeing children return through the different avenues of family court? And so that was through foster care, through abuse or neglect proceedings, that was through voluntary placements. There's going to be different language on in different states. That was through delinquency proceedings where you would have, and it would be very, very striking when decisions are being made whether or not that young person needs to be remanded, that the adoptive parent would stand up, but very, very firmly state, not just I'm the parent, but I'm the adoptive parent, very distancing from themselves. And also through what's called PINS petitions, which is the child is outside of my control and I can no longer care for them. And custody and guardianship, where other people are coming forward and taking care of the young people. Now, that's obviously all formal actions. So there's some record of what's happening to those young people. However, it's not often counted because children's names change. And I hate to say this because children should never just be a number, but their child identification number in the federal and the state systems also change because they come in through a different parent. So they can't always be matched to know that this young person had been previously adopted. And so there's a lot of ways that we are missing out in terms of not gathering information, to understand how big this issue really is. The other ways that we see children moving post-adoption is through rehoming, and that's officially or unofficially. And when I say officially, that may not be through court proceedings. That they may be giving a notarized statement or a guardianship to another person to continue to care for that young person, but also homelessness. We saw kids out on the street, and Jaquan was one of them who had nowhere to go, and a church took him in and let him sleep in the basement. And in New York City, the adoption subsidy goes to 21. And so he was struggling all these years while his adoptive mother continued to receive the adoption subsidy, and also just couch surfing. But one of the last issues is institutionalization, which is an issue that I've become much more involved with in the last year. Of course, institutionalization through foster care is something that I'm very familiar with, but I was not as familiar with what I would call the so-called troubled teen industry. I always consider that to be somewhat of a separate issue. It was not the same demographic as my client population. And that, to my shame, was my bias, because I think some of the faces that are on that movement. But as it happens, a significant portion of young people who are in the so-called troubled teen industry uh, are adoptees. And that's something that I've been researching, and I'll speak about further on in this presentation. I'm seeing some quick chats. I'm just going to, I am willing to take questions throughout. I'm trying to reserve 15 minutes, but if it's a really urgent question, then feel free to jump in. I'm not going to be able to continue to look at the chat. I don't want to mess up how the presentation is moving. So actually
Well,
let me,
well, I'll jump in and just say that I think one clarification might be on, I think a lot of us our minds were blown when you said that the parents are still getting paid.
yes.
And I think that must be just foster parents, no? Because,
Well, adoptive.
well, adoptive foster parents.
Yes.
So foster parents who then adopted. Okay,
Yes.
because not all adoptive parents get paid.
And
I mean,
it's very state dependent too. I understand in some states, if
Mm.
you're kinship versus non-kinship, and obviously and also can make a significant difference in how much you get. But in
Yeah,
New York City, and so I do want to preface that by
yeah.
saying everyone gets the same amount in New York City. Not only that, is that you also have what's called subsidized kinship guardianships, because there was a movement of, particularly for older youth, we do not want to sever ties. They want to continue to have relationships. Let's do this as a subsidized guardianship. So then it's the same type of payment, just called something else.
And then just as further clarification, like for instance, I'm in a private adoptive parent. I've never gotten paid. So,
No, private, yes, thank you. So private, no. And intercountry, no, there are no subsidies involved with that. This is out of child welfare and foster care.
okay, thank you.
All right. So, and just to speak to the issue of the adoption subsidy, that's an issue I'm incredibly passionate about. Every state has this issue. Every state is continuing to pay adoptive parents who are no longer caring for the child, even if that child is back in foster care. The most egregious example in New York City was an adoptive father who killed the adoptive mother, 4 children placed back into foster care, and the subsidies continued to be electronically deposited while he was in jail. And the reason why, and this is mind blowing, and many people really, you can't fathom how does this happen. And I've written about this, and I'm happy to send the article out, is it's the way that the federal guidance is written. And it's also because of the way that adoptive parents are constitutionally placed in the same shoes as biological parents. And so the argument is that the state has no right to go in and check on a family and make sure you're continuing to care for that child, just because an adoption occurred. And so my argument has always been, if you're accepting money from the state, then that allows you that you open yourself up to that. And from a, you know, adoptive parents are supposed to report back through yearly, letters saying we're continuing to care for the child or the child's still in school. However, there are no repercussions if the letter's not returned. And you can also just lie on the letter. And one of the most egregious examples was in 2007, was the case of Judith Leakin, who was foster parent, adoptive parent of 11 special needs children out of New York, received 1.56 million. And she bought multiple homes in Florida, and the children were found in the streets, and one was presumed dead. And even then, the federal judge said, I don't understand how, these subsidies can continue to be paid. This needs to be addressed. And it still has not been addressed on the federal level. Now, New York City just passed in December 2024 an adoption subsidy legislation, and we're the first state to do that. And it took us 7 years to pass that, because we had a lot of pushback, particularly from, frankly, adoptive foster parents who said, we do not want oversight after adoption. And we shouldn't have anyone looking into our lives. But it took 7 years, but that was just passed. So to move on, in terms of what we do know about broken adoptions, where is the data? So data is captured on the federal level through a system called AFCARS. And twice yearly, states are required to upload all of their data into this federal database, which captures all of these data elements about what the child, what their permanency goal is, what their, every kind of demographic that you might think of. And however, AFCARS doesn't actually capture broken adoptions. So, and I say that in the sense that it's not a data point that they ask for, that they used to ask for. And so the only reason, if you did a deep dive into the federal data set to know whether children were returning back, is if you can match up. If in the case notes someone said this was an adopted child that was returned, or there was some other notation in another demographic that indicated that. And I'll get to a study that actually looked at that. Some of the known data, in 2011, when I realized that there were so many children returning to family court and no one wanted to talk about it, mind you, I'm an aggressive trial attorney. So I had to figure out a strategy. How do I get people on board with me, particularly ACS, who I was often, hammering, and get them to also be on board in doing something about this issue? So what I started off by doing was doing a study within my own office at the Children's Law Center of how many adoptees we were seeing in custody and guardianship cases. And I ended up co-publishing a law review article, which includes Youth Voice, but also really significantly, the judicial system allowed us to do an anonymous survey of the judges and also of attorneys to be able to get quotations from them about what they were seeing and some of their thoughts around this issue. And that law review article and the study is on my website, and I can also circulate that. But I'll give you a little bit more information about that. But after the law review article went out and I hand delivered it to every judge and also started having meetings about it. And this was something about systemic reform that I didn't realize is how many times you had to have the same conversation with so many different groups to be able to reach a point of collaboration. And it took a few years, and which was very frustrating for me because I don't have a lot of patience, and particularly, you want to see things done. But it did happen where we reached a point where other firms and other institutions started collecting data and saying, yes, this is something important. Let's talk about it. And so Lawyers for Children is another law firm in New York City that did their own study. Covenant House is obviously a national shelter program, and their New York shelter did a study as well, and I'll give you some of the results of that. But when you look at social science research, and for the adoption professionals who are on here, language matters in terms of sometimes what you'll see is social science literature that says adoption disruptions are very, very low. It accounts for like less than 1 or 2%. And the reason is because is how do you define it? Dissolution is a legal term. Dissolution means a formal termination of the adoptive parent's rights. And so that doesn't happen often. You can have children return to foster care and they still won't terminate the adoptive parent's rights. So if you're looking just at dissolutions, that can account for just a very small number because we don't know how many young people are still back in the system, but the relationship, the adoptive relationship was never severed because child welfare systems do not want to create more legal orphans. Okay. The other reason is that disruption is also defined differently by different populations. Disruption can not only mean post-adoption, but can also mean pre-adoption, but you disrupt from the pre-adoptive home. And so when you look at social science literature and research, then it makes it difficult because I've gotten a lot of pushback saying, well, the numbers are really, really low. This is an issue that we should be concerned about, but we're not capturing the right information or we're not asking the right questions. Now, USA Today did do a deep data dive into the big AFCARS data system, and I'll speak to that. But my overall point with this is if we don't know numbers, then we can't effectuate change on an individual level or on a systemic level. So the Children's Law Center, I did an internal study. I'm a pretend researcher where literally I just went through our filing cabinets and looked at guardianship cases where it was clear from the petition that the child had been adopted. Now, my law review article goes through all of the results of that study, including demographics like birth parent and birth family and other things. But I wanted to give a very brief overview is that what we saw was that 75% of the broken adoptions and the guardianship cases that we looked at were due to the death or infirmity of the adoptive parent. And that may seem surprising to some people, but that's also because of the ages of who's allowed to adopt. And so, for example, we would see a 71-year-old adopt a 9-year-old, a 66-year-old adopt an infant. And so I had various recommendations at that. And in New York, if you adopt over a certain age, you're supposed to have a backup resource that will step up and take care of the child in the event of death or infirmity. However, we found that it was often biological parents and family that were stepping forward and taking care of children, even though, you know, we saw situations where an adoptive parent had Alzheimer's and again is in a nursing home receiving care and the adoption subsidy going to them. But these are young children that no one was taking care of. But formally, we saw death or infirmity as the predominant in guardianship cases. We also saw that in a lot of cases, and this is obviously very child directed because this is from the child's interviews, is that abuse and neglect was alleged. However, it was never charged by child welfare. And I posit that adoptive parents often there's a double standard in terms of how we view what adoptive parents do versus what we would view as a biological parent. And that influences how child welfare approaches cases. One thing that we also observed in the cases that we looked at is that post-adoption services was really not involved. And but also we don't know how post-adoption services was defined by the families because there was a huge push, particularly in the 2000s, to have more post-adoption services, to have funding that goes towards that. And however, what what in New York City, we weren't sure if we were seeing post-adoption mean that the child just had therapy that had continued on. And that's what the family might have meant. It might not have actually meant real formalized post-adoption services to help stabilize families. Brooke?
Hey, there were just a couple of questions in the chat that I thought you might want to. One was clarifying what do you see as the double standard in them investigating abuse.
So the double standard is not only the investigation of abuse, but also, for example, if you leave a child at a mental health hospital and say, I no longer want to care for them. In most cases, I would see that here's a clear example. Child was adopted as an infant, was 15 years old, abandoned at a mental health facility, and adoptive parent said, don't want her, don't care. And we were involved with the guardianship proceeding. I was with the child welfare attorney saying, why aren't you filing something? This is clear abandonment. And then if you file something, then services can be provided through an Article 10 petition to be able to help stabilize that particular child. And he looked at me and he said, what do you think? She's crazy, referring to the child. As if we are asking adoptive parents to take on such a huge burden that we need to give them a pass when things like this happen. The other thing that I think happens frequently is there's somewhat of a conflict of interest, potentially, in having the same agency that qualified you to be an adoptive parent do an investigation of you, of abuse and neglect. And so are they going to hold the person to the same standard? Are they going to overlook things, particularly when, but I often saw really serious cases of abuse or neglect or abandonment, and very, very rarely saw actual cases brought in family court, even though with 100% certainty, I can say, had it been a biological parent, there would have been a case. And that's what I mean by double standard. And so if you look at abuse and neglect cases and when adoptive parents are charged, and there's some numbers captured around that, I think that is a really significant underestimation of the number because of these issues.
The one other question was, have there been any attempts to sue on behalf of a child to recapture the money that was misappropriated after abandonment? I love that face.
Yes, actually. So yes. So what we started doing is trying to bring child support cases. And so we brought and so if a child was over the age of 18, then we brought it on behalf of them so they could get it to 21. If the child was under 18, then the new guardian might pursue a child support case. And so, and I can circulate, an article that I wrote about this, but we were successful in arguing because adoption subsidy is not counted as income for taxable purposes. So adoptive parents would say, you cannot use this against me as child support because it's not actually income. And so we actually went to the appellate division and argued on this case and received very, very favorable case law. Even if the adoptive parent suddenly said, all right, I don't want the adoption subsidy anymore, what we then argued is that that was as if it was a bio parent who quit their job because they didn't want to support their child anymore, that should be imputed income to them. And so we were able to successfully argue that in these type of cases, that the amount of the subsidy should be paid to the person taking care of the child or to the young person themselves. Now, the adoption subsidy itself cannot be simply transferred to a new person, and that's another complicated factor, is because the contract is signed between the adoptive parent and the state. So it's only upon the death of an adoptive parent that a new agreement could possibly be done. But yes, we did try to do some various lawsuits around that. In terms of other studies, Lawyers for Children is an office in New York City that handles what a significant portion of voluntary placement agreements. That's children who are voluntarily placed into foster care. They did a manual hand count, and this was years ago. I would love to see what it looks like more recently. But they found that 1/5 of their caseload of voluntary placements were adoptees. That was 200 out of 1,000 of their clients. 200 on their caseload, adoptees that were in foster care that had been returned by adoptive parents. And they did further study around that as to how many actually had continued contact with their adoptive parents and whether or not they were placed in the community or were they placed in higher levels of care. And curiously and interestingly enough, the majority were in community care, even though the adoptive parent said, I couldn't control them myself, but somehow they manage in foster care. And now we see this double stream of adoption subsidy being paid. So we have the child being paid for twice at this point, for their new placement and to the adoptive parent. But that was a really significant number from that particular law firm. Okay, so I'm not sure where my homelessness. So actually, homeless, Covenant House did their study, and they extrapolated that in New York City, they were seeing 120 per year young people under the age of 18 that were on the streets and had no one to turn to. And so obviously they're capturing coming through a shelter system, but if you're on the streets and not encountering any system, then those numbers are not going to be captured. Now, USA Today in 2022 did a significant data dive, and I kind of worked in the background with their investigative journalist. They did a massive amount of work where they got the raw data from the federal government and just combed through it. I don't know how. And they were able to calculate, based between 2008 and 2020, that 66,000 adoptees returned to foster care. That was 12 children per day. And the risk factors of that return were being Black, being older at adoption, or having been diagnosed with a mental health condition. And so I would encourage anyone that it's a 3-part series by USA Today in 2022 to take a look at that series. But that is a significant undercount, in my opinion. And that's because, as I spoke about previously, broken adoptions was not a data point that you would capture. So they were only able to find this through other means, not through just running, one code that says find, all the check marks in this particular category of adoptees who were returned to care. And so I actually think this is a really significant undercount because broken adoptions was not added as a data point until later. Now, in 2014, I led an effort to get broken adoptions added as a data point to AFCARS. It was not added until just a couple of years ago, and that was because changes in the administration, because LGBTQ had been added as a data point, that prior administration had wanted it removed, and so it went through a lot of changes. But even in the most recent data cycle, it has not been truly captured. Also, these systems are so complex, the states also have to revamp their computer systems. So it's going to take some time before we ever really see the actual data element of broken adoptions. And data is only as good as the data that's inputted and the caseworker that inputted it. So rehoming is in 2013, this became, Megan Toohey did this article, Americans Use the Internet to Abandon Children Adopted from Overseas. And she had done this investigation looking at Facebook forums and other places. And this was really big news at the time. And at the time, it was frustrating for me because I was saying, what about all these foster care adoptions? This isn't just, private adoptions that are getting rehomed. But that's where the term rehoming started, was from the Megan Twohey article and the work that she did. But one of the worst examples of rehoming was this Arkansas legislator here, who adopted 3 young girls, um, and then gave guardianship of them to, I think, a daycare owner, where one of the girls ended up significantly abused, and it became public. And there he also, you can look up some of the articles yourself, but that was one of the, there's rehoming that's done every day. Just until recently, there were Facebook sites talking about rehoming, and that was unofficially, it wasn't through any official agency. And so that's really scary, because who's checking out these people? This isn't a state system that's actually doing a home study or anything like that. You're just passing off kids. And so for inter-country adoptees, what the article that Megan Toohey was about was how advertising kids for rehoming. Now there is, I don't want to get down on any adoption agency, but I did look up that there is an agency that is doing second adoptions. And it was really disturbing to me to look up, because they advertise the children on the site. And they say, and they have the picture, and they say the adoptive parent can no longer care for these reasons, and that the child is wanting these things, and this is what this child needs. And it just frankly makes my skin crawl. And that's through official channels. But there are a huge number of unofficial channels where it's happening. A hand up I saw. Okay.
Yeah,
So
go
we
ahead,
talked
Dawn. Can you unmute? There you go.
Sorry, it was an accident. I didn't need to. I'm trying not to have a breakdown listening to this. Just so sad. But
I'm sorry.
okay.
Should have done trigger warning as well in the beginning. So institutionalization is something that I have started doing a lot more advocacy around in the last year. Now, I at one point did I was part of a law firm that sued child welfare systems for their failures to take care of foster children. I was part of a lawsuit in Oregon and West Virginia and led those investigations. So certainly, I knew high numbers of kids, foster kids, were being placed in residential care. There's a lot of profit to be made in the behavioral health industry. And this is where I said that, my understanding of the population of troubled teen industry was different than what it actually is. I considered that to be separate than the institutions that I was looking at. However, it's really mixed. And so, and you have also the facilities that are also just private pay. And so in the facilities that I was investigating, you have these huge umbrella organizations like Sequel or Acadia or UHS or Devereaux, and they have all these, programs all across the country. And we have recordings of them talking about the secret sauce of how to make profit for their shareholders and their stakeholders, and in their board meetings talking about the secret sauce is keeping costs down, which is meaning having unqualified staff, to make maximum profit. And they're charging states up to $1,000 a day, sometimes for placement of children, and it can be anywhere in the country. And so at the time when I was suing these child welfare systems, we were seeing a lot of kids being sent from out of state to places all over the country where they were not being monitored or supervised, and where significant abuses were happening. However, there's also this troubled teen industry, and yes, adoptees can also be placed in many of the same facilities that I was investigating through health insurance and other mechanisms. However, I ended up getting involved in a situation in March 2014 in Jamaica where 8 boys were removed from an American-owned facility called a therapeutic boarding school, Atlantis Leadership Academy. And I had been contacted to say 3 of them were adoptees and their adoptive parents were not planning on returning them to the US. And so I understand, the bureaucracy of child welfare. And so I flew to Jamaica to be able to offer my services, to be able to work on returning those young people back to the US and finding resources for them. And I failed. No county, no state would take those children, even though the adoptive parents had clearly said not doing it. And it was really disturbing that we had this hot potato between the federal government and no one wanting to take these children when you have adoptive parents who, as I said, the double standard, why aren't they being charged for abandoning these kids? And these kids were in foster care in Jamaica. And so after 60 days, because I failed, they were placed into the permanent custody of Jamaica. And so, and they were all adoptees of color, into very wealthy, rich, wealthy, religious, fundamentalist homes. But that experience really opened me up into the population in the troubled teen industry. And while I was in Jamaica, I learned of another facility called Youth the Vision Academy that has 160 to 180 adoptees from the US. And at the time, I was thinking, why are so many adoptees, in Jamaica, and they're solely marketing themselves for adoption. And so I began Themis Youth Law and Advocacy to be able to advocate for these young people. I still work for the 3 young boys who are back in the US, but who are struggling, and who are homeless and who, struggle on a day-to-day basis. And I started the nonprofit with no grant money. So I've self-funded it for the last year. But the issue of adoptees being warehoused in facilities till the age of 18, where they're then abandoned, that's what I'm currently investigating. And I collect my own data around this issue, and I can speak to some of what I've found. But the majority of young people that I have interviewed that are survivors of Youth the Vision Academy have had no contact with their adoptive families in years. They were warehoused at low rates because it's cheaper in Jamaica until 18. And then if they made it back to the US, they were dropped off at the US port of entry, which was Florida. So I'm going to share with you this young person. Hi, Candy. So she's just going to explain why she thinks she was abandoned. Critical in understanding. Sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead a little. Causes of parents abandoning adoptee and or institutionalizing them.
So thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be a voice for all of the kids who have been abandoned and institutionalized. And for your first question, some of the main causes that I have seen is, the kids acting out. They're not able to communicate properly. And a lot of it comes from displaced anger. And I feel like that's not something that a lot of the parents understand, that a lot of the anger that we have is displaced. It's not towards any of you. It just has to come from the fact that we aren't happy with where we are and we don't feel right.
And would you say that's based on trauma? Is this also part of adolescent behavior and development?
I would say some of it's based on trauma, and a lot of it is part of adolescent behavior. Apart from being a normal teenager who's going to have a bit of a lip on them, or a kid who's going to throw tantrums, a lot of our tantrums and or arguments might look a little bit more severe, simply because we have been through so much And our trauma really does shine through during those situations. Because again, another thing you have to remember is within being in the system and being adopted and, you know, being removed from the house that we were all formerly in, during that time, we are dealing with our own emotions and realizing that we have been abandoned by our parents and or loved ones, and we don't know how to communicate that. And on top of it, we just don't realize what we did wrong. So a lot of it is going to look like we are taking out on you, and it might look a little bit more severe, but it all runs down to trauma, confusion, and the fact that we have to build trust with you because our trust has been broken.
Hi, Candy. Now, that seems so basic, right? Why are we talking about trauma and behavior? And so I put this little sketch up. Don't spread it around, but on the really tough ones, I just go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And I say that in this list of psychological concepts because when children are in foster care, and what I talk about in my law review article and what my findings are today, is that one, you have caseworkers that don't have degrees that are saying, well, children are well attached, or, you know, they have a really significant bond, or they're talking about these mental health without actually having a qualification to do that, but they're testifying to the judge. And we're not having real great mental health assessments that are done of children in foster care or post-adoption. But all of these issues of attachment, bonding, identity, and I say identity because for a young person who's adopted, it may be, you know, that they want to reach out to biological family, but then you have an adoptive family that's threatened by that. And so there's a lot of gaps in terms of education about what to expect post-adoption. And even if a child is adopted young, what to expect when they hit adolescence. Because my findings were, in my original study, is that kids were getting kicked out for what looked like normal adolescent behavior. Now, I'm a child of the 80s, and maybe once I was caught chasing my brother with a knife around the house. You know, so maybe my perspective is different, but I look at these kids who were doing like drug experimentation and other things of what I would think would be normal. And I'm certainly not a psychologist, but seem to fall within the realm of normal adolescent behavior. And that just, you know, people were like, no, we're not going to tolerate it from you. Like somehow we put this idea of perfection, not only on the white picket fence family, but on the child themselves. And we also blame it all on the child without looking at the entire family and how the adoptive parents are reacting, which is really, really critical and a significant issue where I think we are, that we're failing at. And we're not understanding loss and the trauma. And so, yes, it's basic, but the problem is for a lot of these adoptees, they're not getting quality mental health treatment. They're not getting adoption competent, you know, they're not getting treated as part of a family unit where the adoptive parents' behaviors are also being looked at and it's all being blamed on the child. And there's this hypercriticism of the child themselves that's occurring, which is significant. Now, in terms of my current work, as I said, I'm working with a lot of survivors from Youth Vision Academy, who completely abandoned, warehoused, institutionalized. And in this investigation, and well, some of this will become public through an investigative series in a few months, but we found that in the US, there are 123 facilities that market themselves solely for adoption. And that seems huge, but some of them might be like unregulated kind of respite foster group homes, It may not be licensed. There are a lot of religious facilities. So, my definition of what I'm talking about, we're not talking about licensed, regulated, and that's a huge problem because we're warehousing and abandoning kids in unlicensed, unregulated facilities out and the one I'm working with outside of the US, where kids are getting abused and neglected, allegedly. And so in my study, because I collect all the data from the interviews, is that, we saw significant issues of particularly around private intercountry adoptions, religious homes, where there's a rigidity of thinking where you should love me and I don't understand, why you're acting out, and because you are listening to this type of music, that kids were getting sent overseas. Transracial was a huge issue where a teacher who I interviewed as a third party told me, I advised after the George Floyd fatality, and when the Black Lives Movement matter, that maybe they could do some education with their adopted son around this, and the family was like, no, you know he should act like my other son. Why would we do that? And so and we're and or exploration of Black identity. All of a sudden, young little cute Black kids suddenly became threatening when they became adolescents. So these are some of the things I was saying, what I am saying when I say transracial. Untreated trauma. The young lady who I was interviewing before she was institutionalized, she never saw a therapist. It was straight to an unregulated facility where she was never picked up. Lack of medical and mental health treatment, where in the intercountry adoptees that I'm looking at, one of them was autistic, adopted from China, and within a year of the adoption, and profoundly autistic, was sent to overseas to this facility where she's been warehoused for 9 years. But also, I will say that there are adoptive parents who are really desperate for quality treatment and don't know where to go. And then you see an affordable program. And I can't emphasize this enough. The young lady speaks about this, and all the kids speak about it. It can look great on paper. It can look beautiful website. But is it really US approved treatments that are treatments? And who's providing the treatments? Because I find it very curious. Why are we sending all of these adoptees outside of the country? Do we think that there are all these professionals that are in this very poor area of Jamaica to provide all this treatment? The blindness around this is really, really astounding. And the treatment modality actually comes from the work of Nancy Thomas, who is affiliated with certain holding treatments and techniques that have been my apologies, the word is escaping me, but the APA, various other organizations have come out against because they can be so dangerous for children. But the young people that I'm working with have experienced a lot of abuse or neglect and certainly not receiving any treatment. Family dynamics, it's all about the kid. The kid gets blamed for everything, and no one is looking at the adoptive parent. Why are you reacting it this way? Is this reasonable for you to have this expectation of this young person? Lots of kids' sexual orientation and exploitation. And this is a very strict religious facility. And so we're outsourcing, abuse in a way, and conversion therapy. Obstruction of child protective investigations, where they're sending kids away because they're in the midst of an investigation. So these are, in my current work, what I'm seeing of why kids are being sent away, and certainly normal adolescent behavior. We're not talking about these hardened criminals. who are doing hard drugs and doing, out the streets, and yet that's what they're being treated as. And if there are 160 to 180 in Jamaica, and then there's these 120 other in the US, how many adoptees are at these facilities who no longer have contact with their adoptive families? So again, this shouldn't be a surprise. This makes a very invisible population. They're not tracked by child welfare. They're not protected by the courts. There's harm without accountability. And I say harm without accountability is because all these young people are being abandoned with no money, no education, no life skills, no home, and the huge psychological impact of that. And they are landing in Florida where literally at least two of them have said to me, I didn't even know how to count change. So how can I go apply for a job? They've been institutionalized for over 5 years. So what you might normally pick up in a home environment in the US is not something they're going to be picking up just naturally from hearing things. Like a young lady called me and said, what are taxes? Just something you would have heard about in, in tax season, at least in the regular home. And so there's huge issues with this. And I talked about those 3 boys where the hot potato, where we were literally talking about returning those 3 boys, those 3 original ones through ISS, we were going to return them through ORR, Office of Refugee and Resettlement. That is the agency that takes in migrant children. We were going to treat these children as if they were stateless. And that's what we were talking about and strategizing about when the adoptive parents abandoned them allegedly in Jamaica. And so there's huge gaps in the system. And where's the accountability for the adoptive parents who are leaving all these children, giving them no education, no support? They are paying, $2,500 to house them in Jamaica until they're 18, and then now they're on the streets. And those are the young people that I'm working with right now on an emergency basis, trying to get them emergency housing and addressing their very, very immediate needs. So what's it like to be abandoned?
I was born. I was abandoned by my parents. And they kind of just gave me up and put me into foster care. And then when I was 15 by my adoptive parents, I was left in an institution because of my behavioral issues, that of which I never received therapy for. So I was having all these behavioral issues that my parents weren't happy with, more specifically my father. And I did not get therapy for it. I didn't talk to anybody about it. I wasn't allowed to, right? And when you're a child and when you're 15, you have to ask. You have to ask, but most of the time we're too afraid to.
Right.
So I was institutionalized without any prior help or any prior engagement to try to figure out what was wrong. I was born. I struggle with a lot now.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Long-term impacts of.
I struggle with a lot now. I struggle with relationships. I stay quiet when I'm in pain most of the time, whether it's emotionally, physically, psychologically. I really struggle to maintain healthy relationships and advocate for myself when it's important. And then in the same, I don't speak to my parents anymore. I do not speak to my father. He is somebody who I don't interact with simply because I've been abandoned. And I understand some parents may institutionalize children believing it is because they love their child, but you don't abandon the people that you love. That's just the answer, right?
So in my original law review article, lots of suggestions, which are actually pretty relevant even today, which is we need to look closer at this issue. We need data. I'm going to kind of speed through some of this so I can do a Q&A. But we need to ensure that the adoption subsidy follows the child, that we look more critically at older adoptions. This was very specific to my own study, and also the expansion of parental rights post-adoption, because so many kids were returning to biological parents, and we were doing, the illusion of, leaving them there, but without anyone having an actual order for them. Providing more support and services to families is huge and really, really lacking across the country, but also having a best practices approach. And even when an adoptive family reaches out, how are they going to handle that? There are funds that could potentially be used through what's called Title 4E that can now be used for these type of situations. And why aren't we accessing money to be able to help provide services? But also it should be made long after adoptions are finalized. And how education is so key. And that's where I go back to ongoing trainings. Now, in New York City, you only need one training when you become a foster parent. You don't need a training when you become an pre-adoptive or an adoptive parent. You don't need ongoing trainings like as a professional, like I need, or a social worker would need. So, and when I've asked the state or others, let's do ongoing trainings, they say, well, we don't want to ask too much of them because then they won't become foster parents or adoptive parents. So we're keeping the bar so low. Now, there are states that I've spoken to that do have more rigorous training and all of these things, but if we had more about how to address physical, mental, or emotional disabilities in relation to adolescent behavior and development, that would be huge. Like, I've spoken to one adoptive parent who supposedly, who said, well, I don't know. Well, they said this on the stand. I don't know what their diagnoses are. But you've been taking them to the therapist since before the adoption, and they are on medications. So if you don't know the diagnoses and you're not being brought in to understand, that's a huge issue. And then so there's really significant issues around that. And also just having quality mental health treatment, really comprehensive evaluations, and consistent. I call it the Medicaid mill in New York City, where revolving doors of therapists, usually student interns who are providing therapy to foster kids. But quality mental health treatment is so key. And I can send this out later, but there are key legal and human rights gaps from an anti-trafficking perspective, and where I see where children are being abandoned, and that really places them in a position of being susceptible to trafficking. And I am working with trafficking victims, many of them coming back from Jamaica, and that there's no legal recourse for adoptive abandonment. There's no federal statutes that criminalizes adoptive parents that are abandoning post-finalization or rehomeing. And that's all contributing to this invisible class of kids who can't access services. They can't go back to child welfare. I've called child welfare and said, listen, this child's from your state. Can't you help them? Arizona. And and they're like, well, no, they were adopted, they weren't they were adopted too young to qualify for any services now, Well, this child's homeless and was institutionalized for the last 4 years and has nowhere to go. No one stepping forward, no one taking accountability, and misuse of funds. There are legislative fixes that I think that needs to happen about the movement of children and how we need to have greater scrutiny and accountability built into various statutes. So why don't I have some lived
Your name is
so I want to open it up to a few questions now. It looked like there were a lot popping up, or am I wrong? Because I'm happy to continue.
There was we were discussing. I'm not sure there's lots of questions left, and let someone correct me, or if you're sitting with something you haven't posted.
Okay.
Well, I'll go once again. First of all, how do we clone you? Um, because I can't, you've taken on so much. And so really the question is, how do we support you in your efforts? Somebody did post a link to your nonprofit, so we'll definitely go there. But I am just in shock at what we've learned, and this is so painful. But I think some of us have been coming around to this without even knowing about all this abuse. I'm an adoptive parent, but I'm also a birth grandparent. And I'm kind of a misfit, in that our open adoption with my daughter, who's out of the Vietnamese refugee community here, she grew up seeing them every 6 weeks and sometimes just on her own. So we're a blended family, basically. We're crazy looking, but we are a blended family. When she decided to relinquish her parenting rights to um, her daughter, which was very painful, but she said, you know what I want. She was very young. And she had all the options. Let me tell you, my druthers would have been that I could have raised for a while. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. Um, but that's what she chose. And she said, if we could have the same kind of open adoption as I had, that would be great. And she really put a lot of thought into her choice. But we had to go through the painful point of the adoptive parents cutting us off after a few years. Evidently, they had been told that we would lose interest after 5 years and that just to go ahead um, so I think of that as broken promises. I think these open adoption agreements are a joke. Even if they were enforceable, um, they should be updated and renewed because, as you pointed out, we forget about it after that one moment. It's as if that transaction is it. And really, everything happens after
Yeah.
adoption. So I don't know how to get the attention and the reforms going.
Well, a few comments. So, one of the some of the most successful adoptions I've certainly seen have always been where very open communication and involvement of everyone. But that takes a lot of education and a lack of threat and really needs to start early in foster care, particularly. So we're not having visitation in the sterile little room. Why aren't we making it more um, involved and in the community and these type of things? I also have done a lot of work around post-adoption sibling visitation rights. And so I did a whole law review article around that, and we actually passed legislation really quickly to ensure that to put on the books that sibling rights are not terminated just because parents' rights are. But
Right.
in that, I talk about how that these agreements that are signed at the time of adoption, that there are real enforceability issues in general around it, and so you can read some of that in some of the work that I've written. Um, and certainly in terms of the work that I'm doing, education is getting the word out there, getting people to know and understand. I've started doing TikTok, which is like the most it's like anyway it's really awkward for me, but I'm doing it, and trying to, and so I have actually a lot of young people that reach out to me via that. But I try to educate through various platforms to at least, in the quick 7-second snippets that, literature says that we need to capture attention by in social media, so that people can go to the articles to read more about this. There's just so much to talk about it because, California, we just did an investigation there where we learned that adoption assistance funds were being used to institutionalize children at facilities that foster children legally couldn't even be at because of abuses. And so, and anyway, that law has just been changed, but there's a lot to talk about. And so please follow me on various I'm on, my more serious ones are obviously Substack, LinkedIn, but I'm on all the platforms. And my nonprofit, as I said, right now is unfunded, and I've self-funded it, which means I took out my retirement. And I believe in this so much that I was willing to do that. And so a lot of it has been trying to keep the money that's been donated has really been going more towards the emergency needs of young people. Last night, Adoptee, one of the original three, was on the streets and has been on the streets all week. So I put him up one night in a hotel room, and then I'm going to bus him somewhere tomorrow. One of the other ones, unfortunately, was assaulted and stabbed. And so, and others where they're landing in Florida, and I'm trying to get them to, an area where they might find support. So donations it's a nonprofit, it's obviously nonprofit. I do not want to be a private attorney where I'm making money off the abuse of children. So that's why I've set it up as a nonprofit. But it has been a struggle. But do follow me, and hear more from the young. So like and hear more from the young people who are experiencing it. Ruby, you had a question.
I did. Thanks, Dawn. This has been super interesting. And as a private inter-country adoptee who ended up in a religious household, I'm feeling lucky and grateful for the first time in a while. So thanks for all the information, and I will definitely follow you on TikTok. I have a question, just picking up on the point you talked about the situations where children are actually returned to their biological families and yet no order is made in order to protect that. Is it not the case that actually a legislation around adoption is for the adoptive parents rather than being child-centered? I used to be an attorney in England, and we had a recent case law a couple of years ago where a situation where a biological parent had ended up living with the adoptive family during the pandemic, obviously unprecedented times, and rebuilt the relationship with the child. Everything was wonderful. The parent was back in a position where she could take care of the child. And so they applied to court to annul the adoption and have the child returned. And the case was refused on the basis that the law does not allow for that. And so I'm wondering, I love the work that you're doing, and obviously the amendments to legislation and the things that are suggesting, but is it your view that these things, that actually the whole thing needs to be undone because it starts from the place that's just wrong, right?
Well, we're having a lot of conversation, obviously, about child welfare abolition, and foster care abolition, and these kind of conversations that, more money should be invested in keeping children at home, not paying it to foster parents, particularly because we know that most kids are removed on neglect reasons because of poverty. And so and I think you're right, is that it is often centered on all the adults and the adoptive parents, not on the children. Kids don't necessarily have constitutional rights. Adoptive parents have more rights. And then that is creating these inequities. And I'm also working with people overseas, because now that we're having kids that are placed internationally, and I'm dealing with intercountry adoptions, where I've gone and met with embassies and said, by the way, this is what's happening with your kids. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but feel free to follow up with me, because we're doing advocacy, and I'm hoping England can put some pressure, and we could use UN conventions and treaties potentially to do some of the work around some of these US adoptees, because the US may not have signed on to all these conventions, but Jamaica has. And so maybe we could be doing more internationally. There's just so many threads to this, but restoration of parental rights is something that is happening more. However, it became, I advocated for it in 2011 to be able, to make sure that there are legal orders in place What ended up being passed in New York was that a very narrow exception where you could restore your parental rights as long as your rights had been terminated, but the child was not yet adopted. That's a narrow window of restoring rights, and it completely ignores all these other adoptees. In the US, we were kind of going through, and in New York, I mean, this legal fiction of giving custody orders to the biological parents. But I've seen judges who said, no, you have no standing, even though a stranger can apply for custody or guardianship, they would refuse that. And so it's really state to state, and it's a patchwork. But I do want to share with you some other youth voice in this. This is a young man talking about when I had his petition, we filed a petition to change his name back. He's one of the original abandoned adoptees, and we were successful.
Your name is something like nobody could take from you. And it's one thing that like holds dearly to people because it's like something people call you every day. So it's like when when you known as something or you have people calling you something growing up and then people change your name, it kind of deteriorates you because it's like also like people gonna call you that name, you go like that's not even really my name. You know what I'm saying? So it's like that's what it means to me because it's like now I feel like I'm really my mama child, which I already knew I was because, I live with my mama. But it's like now I really, people are not going to be asking why is his name this and then your mama name. Like, but I'm black, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it's like I want my original name that my mama gave me. You know what I'm saying?
It did seem. I actually have had clients who've talked about, and I've witnessed this, where it appeared that their names were whitened after they were adopted. Is that something?
Happened to my brother too. They changed his name.
Is that something that you identify with? That it felt like they whitened your name?
Yeah.
Remind me how old you were when you were adopted when your name was changed. I think maybe 8.
Yeah, I want to say like 8-ish, maybe 8-ish. Maybe a little older.
I mean, because that's so much about identity and who you are.
Imagine, like, I was still like, I grew up with my mama. I grew up with, what's it called? My auntie.
Your great aunt.
Yeah. And that's all I used to call.
So I share that because I have seen a lot of kids' names changed at much older ages. And why are we changing kids' names when that's a part of their identity and creates more identity issues for them? And the whitening of it is huge. Seeing, that's something that I've seen in New York, but I continue to be mystified on why names are changed at older ages. But identity is so crucial. And, it's a struggle enough being an adoptee. And then adding that onto it. So I just wanted to share that because he did reclaim his identity. For one of the young ladies who was abandoned for 5 years, and landed back in the US with no education, she self-studied and got her GED. But I can't pass the GED. And I was with her when she passed the last exam.
What happened? I passed it, like I graduated, like it's official, like I passed. Oh my God, I did it. It said you did it. It's official. You are now a
but she is the rare exception of all the ones that I'm working with who could do that and who have, the fortitude and the time, who was able to study and get a laptop and do all of those things. But as I said, most of the ones that I'm working with are struggling to this day. And so how can you even work on your emotional health when you're not even physically safe? How can you study if you're not even in a place to be able to do so? And so the young people I'm working with, and I call them kids, but they're generally between 18 and 22, are in fairly desperate circumstances. And, I just want to share this as a last point is, this is a young person. They, I guess you can upload your lyrics and then someone else puts it to music. But here they talked about their institutionalization and what they feel now. And this language is just really strong to me.
I'm not fears, my soul in chains. Every whisper, every cry, hoping for a change. You know, just incredibly powerful what young people are sharing. And I'm actually going to put on my website, my nonprofit website, a page just for art and other things of youth voice. It's going to be my youth voice section of things that they write to me and other things. But, you know, it's so important to listen to young people, and that young person who wrote that song is in a much better place, but that's what they felt at the time when they were abandoned and institutionalized. So you know, in the end, the promise of family shouldn't have an expiration date. Family can be created, and many of these young people are creating it later through, you know, other connections. I have two websites. There's the Don J. Post LLC and donjpost.com. There's a publications page, and that's where you can find my law review articles and other things. And then my nonprofit is Themis Youth Law and Advocacy. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put my email on there, but you can email me at dawn, DAWN, at dawnjpost.com. And I will respond and send more materials and follow up with anything else, other thoughts that people may have after this. But I do have a lot of materials, and I can get those to you. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And please go out there and start help educating and advocating and remain in touch and in contact. And I hope that, and there is promise for many of these young people. It is depressing to talk about, but some of them are doing really well. And I'm fighting every day to continue to try to make sure that they are in a better place wherever they might be.